June 4, 1942, roughly 10:20 in the morning, Central Pacific, about 200 nautical miles northwest of a small coral atoll called Midway. Vice Admiral Nagumo is standing on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi. His flight deck below him is a genuinely controlled chaos of activity. Ordnance crews are wheeling torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs across the boards. Fuel lines are running. The morning strike against Midway itself has already come home and been recovered without significant loss. The combat air patrol overhead has spent the last hour and a half methodically shredding successive waves of American torpedo bombers. Not a single American torpedo has scored a hit. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, are still steaming in loose formation, undamaged, fully operational, holding the strongest concentration of naval air power anywhere on Earth. He is, at this specific moment, 6 minutes away from losing 3 of them. He does not know this. Neither does anyone else on his bridge, and when historians later trace exactly why he could not see what was about to happen to him, they arrive at an answer that is genuinely stranger than the story most people have been told about this battle. The familiar version of Midway compresses the whole thing into a single dramatic phrase. 5 fateful minutes. The American dive bombers arriving from 20,000 feet at precisely the right moment, catching the Japanese decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, and turning 3 fleet carriers into burning wrecks in the span of about 6 minutes of actual attack. That version is not wrong exactly. It is simply the surface of something considerably deeper. Nagumo was not a foolish officer. Yamamoto, who had designed the operation, was not a foolish officer either. Their pilots were, by mid-1942, among the most combat-experienced naval aviators in the world. 6 months earlier, these same men had struck Pearl Harbor. They had ranged across the Indian Ocean, sinking British carriers and cruisers, essentially at will. They had 4 fleet carriers at Midway to America's 3, and they lost every one of them inside a single day. The question worth asking is not what happened in those 6 minutes. The question is what specifically made those 6 minutes possible at all. The answer begins about 3,000 miles east, in a windowless basement office in the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO. A code-breaking unit staffed by roughly 100 people working under a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort himself had spent years learning Japanese in Tokyo during the 1920s and had personally studied cryptanalysis longer than almost anyone else in the American Navy. His people worked 12-hour shifts in slippers and bathrobes because the basement air conditioning ran cold enough that ordinary uniforms were uncomfortable. They were attempting to read a Japanese naval code the American Navy designated JN-25. By the spring of 1942, HYPO could recover perhaps 10 to 15% of any given intercepted JN-25 message. Not the whole thing, fragments, isolated words, occasional phrases, partial sentences with critical portions still missing. But the intercept traffic itself was enormous. The Japanese combined fleet was radioing extensively across the Pacific in preparation for what was clearly a major operation. And in that flow of partially recovered fragments, Rochefort's team began finding the same 2 characters again and again attached to whatever the target of the coming operation actually was. AF. They were confident AF referred to somewhere in the Central Pacific. They believed it was Midway. Washington was not convinced. Some senior officers thought AF meant the Aleutians. Others suspected Hawaii itself. The way Rochefort's team resolved that specific question is worth telling directly, because it captures something about how the American intelligence effort actually operated that the Japanese never fully understood afterward. HYPO sent instructions to the Midway garrison to transmit a plain-language radio message stating that the atoll's water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, an intercepted Japanese naval message reported that AF was short of fresh water. That was the confirmation. Midway, the Japanese cryptographic officers who had transmitted that particular message had no idea they had just told the Americans the exact location of an operation their own admirals believed was still a complete secret. Rochefort's team went further. They identified the approximate date of the attack, the approximate composition of the Japanese striking force, and the approximate direction of approach. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that Admiral Chester Nimitz, sitting in the Pacific Fleet headquarters directly above HYPO's basement, could make a decision no American commander had ever really made before. He decided to believe them. He decided to take 3 aircraft carriers, all the operational carriers the United States possessed in the Pacific at that moment, and position them northeast of Midway before the Japanese arrived. He decided to trust that 100 people in a basement had correctly predicted where and when the Imperial Japanese Navy would show up, and he committed the entire remaining strength of the Pacific Fleet to that prediction. To understand why Nagumo could not see what was waiting for him, you have to understand something specific about the doctrine the Imperial Japanese Navy had built for itself over the previous 20 years. Japanese naval planning at the strategic level was designed around the concept of decisive battle, a single, overwhelming, carefully orchestrated engagement in which the entire striking power of the fleet would concentrate against the enemy at a chosen point and destroy him. Kido Butai, the carrier striking force Nagumo commanded, was the physical embodiment of that doctrine. 4 fleet carriers operating together as one coordinated fist. That concentration was in fact the source of most of Nagumo's tactical advantages. Combined air groups, overlapping combat air patrols, massed strike packages. It had worked at Pearl Harbor, at Rabaul, at Darwin, and across the Indian Ocean. The doctrine contained a hidden assumption. It assumed the enemy could not know in advance where the fist was going to land. Japanese naval intelligence had spent essentially no institutional effort on the possibility that their own codes might be compromised. When American intercepts of JN-25 later became evident through the specific pattern of American operational responses, the initial Japanese assumption was that a Japanese officer somewhere must have been talking. The idea that a foreign navy might have simply broken the code itself, systematically, using distributed civilian mathematical talent rather than a small team of uniformed cryptographers, did not sit naturally inside the doctrinal categories Japanese officers had been trained to think in. There was a second layer to the blindness. Japanese carriers in 1942 did not carry radar. American carriers by June of that year did. When Nagumo's morning strike lifted off toward Midway before dawn, he had no reliable way of knowing whether American ships were within 100 miles of him or 1,000. His reconnaissance float planes were launched from cruiser catapults on a search pattern designed around the assumption that American carriers were probably still at Pearl Harbor. One of those float planes, the one from the cruiser Tone, was launched roughly 30 minutes late that morning because of a catapult malfunction. That specific 30-minute delay meant Nagumo's search sector to the northeast was covered later than the others, and by a single aircraft. When the Tone's float plane finally did spot American surface ships, its initial report described cruisers and destroyers. It took another critical stretch of minutes before a follow-up transmission mentioned that the American formation appeared to include what might be an aircraft carrier. By then, Nagumo was already facing the specific tactical problem that historians have argued about for 80 years. His returning Midway strike leader had radioed back that a second attack on the atoll's defenses would be necessary. Nagumo had reserved a portion of his aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs on the assumption that American ships might appear. When the Midway strike leader's message arrived, and no American ships had yet been reported, Nagumo ordered those reserved aircraft rearmed with fragmentation bombs suitable for a second strike on the atoll. Ordnance crews began pulling torpedoes off Kate bombers on the hangar decks of all 4 carriers and replacing them with land attack ordnance. Then the Tone float plane's follow-up report arrived. American carrier confirmed. Nagumo reversed the order. The ordnance crews now began pulling the just-installed fragmentation bombs off and reinstalling the torpedoes. On the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, live ordnance began piling up in unsafe locations because there was simply not time to strike it below into the magazines. Fuel lines were still open. Aircraft were being shuffled between the hangar and flight decks. The 4 carriers, at the precise moment they most needed to be ready to fight, were in the middle of the most vulnerable operational state a carrier of that era could occupy. Meanwhile, the American torpedo squadrons had begun their attack runs. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, commanded by John Waldron, went in first and was annihilated. Every single aircraft shot down. One survivor. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise followed. Almost the same result. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown after them, also destroyed. Not a single American torpedo scored a hit. From the Japanese bridge, the picture looked overwhelmingly successful. The Combat Air Patrol had done exactly what it was designed to do. The Zero fighters had descended to low altitude to intercept the slow, low-flying American torpedo bombers, and they had methodically shot them out of the sky one after another. This is the specific detail that mattered most. In descending to intercept the torpedo squadrons, the Zero fighters had left the airspace directly above the Japanese carriers, effectively unguarded at higher altitudes. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, two separate groups of American dive bombers arrived over Nagumo's carriers from about 20,000 feet. Wade McCluskey's group from the Enterprise. Maxwell Leslie's group from the Yorktown. They had found the Japanese carriers essentially by accident, in McCluskey's case by following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, that had been detached to depth charge an American submarine and was now steaming at high speed to rejoin the main formation. From their altitude, looking down, the pilots saw 4 aircraft carriers whose flight decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, whose combat air patrol was still at wave-top height, and whose lookouts had not yet spotted them. The dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. Akagi took a bomb hit near the center of the flight deck that penetrated to the hangar and set off the accumulated fuel and unstowed ordnance. Kaga took multiple hits and began burning end to end almost immediately. Soryu took 3 bomb hits within about a minute and was blazing so severely that her captain ordered abandon ship within 20 minutes. The specific interval from the first bomb impact to the moment all 3 of these carriers were burning uncontrollably was approximately 6 minutes. Only Hiryu, steaming somewhat separated from the other 3, escaped the initial attack. Hiryu launched her own counterstrike that afternoon and successfully put American bombs and torpedoes into the Yorktown, crippling her. A few hours later, American dive bombers from the Enterprise found Hiryu herself and left her burning as well. By sunset on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had sortied for Midway were either sinking or already gone. The 4 carriers had taken more than a decade to build, train, and equip. The pilots and air crews aboard them represented an irreplaceable concentration of institutional experience. Japan would spend the remainder of the war trying and failing to reconstitute what she had lost between roughly 10:20 in the morning and sunset that single day. The deeper lesson embedded in Midway is easy to miss because the surface story is so dramatic. It looks, if you read it quickly, like a story about luck. The float plane's late launch, the Arashi's wake, the dive bombers arriving at exactly the right altitude in exactly the right moment. Every one of those specific accidents genuinely happened, but underneath them sat something considerably less accidental. The Americans had built an intelligence system that assumed their own admirals could be told, in advance, roughly where the enemy fleet would appear. The Japanese had built a fleet doctrine that assumed no such thing was possible. When those 2 systems collided in the Central Pacific in early June of 1942, the specific tactical accidents of the morning happened inside a strategic environment where American aircraft carriers were already sitting almost exactly where American codebreakers had predicted the Japanese would find them. That environment was not accidental. It was the product of institutional choices made years earlier about who was allowed to work on codes, how much authority 100 people in a basement should be given, and whether a fleet commander should be willing to stake 3 carriers on their word. Nagumo could not see any of this from the bridge of Akagi, because it was not something a Japanese officer of his training had been taught to look for. The idea that a foreign navy might read your own communications in near real time and reposition its entire remaining fleet on the strength of that reading did not sit inside the categories of naval warfare he had spent his career mastering. Neither did the specific American willingness to trust distributed civilian expertise, mathematicians, linguists, junior officers, pulled from academic backgrounds, over the professional judgment of the more senior officers in Washington, who had initially disagreed with Rochefort's read. There is a version of this same story that keeps appearing in different forms across the whole American war effort. The maps the Germans could not explain, the intelligence at Midway, the code work at Bletchley that the Americans partnered with, radar at every level. In each case, a system built on distributed trust and open civilian expertise turned out to run circles around opponents who had assumed such systems either did not exist or could not possibly be effective. Nagumo lost 4 carriers in a day in the summer of 1942 for essentially the same underlying reason German officers 3 years later could not explain the American maps in their possession. They were looking, in each case, for a shape of enemy organization that was not the shape actually facing them. And by the time the specific outline of that other shape came into view, the war on their side of it was already over.